The contract said 14 months. Structural restoration survey, sub-foundation levels, Veth Noral station, Courtesan mid-ring. I was to map every crack, catalog every load-bearing element, assess every column and arch and grouted joint in the station's original lower vaults before the demolition authority filed its final clearance. The station had been decommissioned 11 years ago. Freight and passenger transit rerouted when the newer Courtesan hub came online, and the demolition order had been sitting in administrative review ever since. As demolition orders tend to do when the structure in question is 600 years old, and nobody wants to be the engineer who signed off on bringing it down wrong. That was where I came in. My name is Neven Soral. I am 67 years old. I spent 39 years as a structural restoration specialist, the kind who goes into the old places, the deep places, the places where the original builders used techniques that nobody fully understands anymore, and I find out what is still holding and what is not. I read stone the way other men read text. I know by the color of a crack whether it is old and stable or recent and moving. I know by the temperature of a wall whether water is traveling behind it. I know by the sound a column makes when I rap it with my knuckle whether it is solid or whether something has been eating the interior for the last 2 centuries. I am not a dramatic man. I have a kit of tools I have carried for 40 years, and I use all of them. I take measurements, and I write them down. I talk to the stone while I work because stone does not argue with you and does not tell you that you are doing it wrong, and after 39 years of working for clients who did both of those things constantly, I find that restful. I accepted the Veth Noral contract because I had nothing else pressing and because the per diem was reasonable and because my daughter had just moved to the outer Courtesan settlements with her husband, and I thought, with the private logic of fathers, that being within a few transit hours of her was better than the alternative. I was given a site billet on level 3, a decommissioned station administrator's quarters, clean and functional, with a window that looked out over the Courtesan freight lanes. I was given a site key, a demolition clearance badge, and a structural survey template that the demolition authority had pre-populated with the wrong column dimensions. I corrected the column dimensions and got to work. The sub-foundation levels of Veth Noral ran 9 deep. Levels 1 through 6 were the standard freight and service underbelly pipe corridors, conduit chases, emergency bypass tunnels, all of it documented and boring. I cleared them in 3 weeks. Level 7 was the original station service vault, built in the 2nd century of the station's operation when the freight traffic outgrew the first-generation infrastructure. The vault ceiling was a continuous barrel arch, hand-dressed stone, remarkably intact. I spent 4 days on level 7 and filed a note recommending architectural preservation. Nobody responded to the note. That was typical. Level 8 was a maintenance corridor connecting the original foundation pilings, enormous basalt columns, each one 3 meters in diameter, sunk into the bedrock of the station's asteroid anchor. The columns were sound. The mortar between the ashlar courses of the corridor walls had shrunk and cracked in the usual way over 6 centuries, and I repointed the worst sections myself, because the demolition authority had not budgeted for remediation labor, and because I do not like to leave deteriorating mortar unattended. It is a personal failing. My wife used to say that I would repoint the mortar joints of the universe if given sufficient time and a good tuck-pointing tool. She died 4 years ago. I still talk to her sometimes, when I am working alone. The stone does not mind. Level 9 was listed on the Demolition Authority's pre-survey as Sub-Foundation Vault Complex, Levels 9A9C. Status: decommissioned, access restricted, no active infrastructure. Last inspection: 47 years prior. Condition: unknown. Clearance required before demolition. The access hatch was at the bottom of a service ladder on the east side of Level 8. It was a heavy disc of bolted iron, 3/4 of a meter across, sealed with 4 bolts that had not been turned in 4.5 decades. I brought my wrench set and my pry bar and a can of penetrating oil, and I spent an afternoon working the bolts free, which is the kind of work I genuinely enjoy, patient, methodical, the satisfaction of things yielding in the correct order. The hatch opened onto a vertical access shaft, ladder-equipped, dropping 8 meters to the floor of 9A. I went down. Level 9A was a rectangular vault, 20 meters by 30, with a groined ceiling that rose to perhaps 6 meters at its highest point. The original builders had used a pale buff-colored limestone for the vault itself, different from the darker basalt used in the levels above, and the stone had a quality in the lamplight that I can only describe as warm. Not warm in the sense of temperature, though it was warmer than the levels above. Warm in the sense of color, of tone. The limestone held the light differently from basalt. It had been cut with considerable skill. The joints were tight and the arch geometry was correct, and the vault was, in all observable respects, structurally sound. There was a sub-bass vibration in the floor. Not strong. Not anything that would register as a mechanical event. If I had not been accustomed to standing very still, in very quiet places and listening, I would not have noticed it at all. But I noticed it. It was low enough that it was more a sensation in the soles of my feet than a sound, a deep, even pulse, regular as a heartbeat, slow as a sleeping thing. I crouched down and put my palm flat on the floor. The stone was warm. Not the ambient warmth of geothermal proximity. I know what that feels like. A steady, undifferentiated heat with no variation. This had a pattern. A rise and a slow fall, spaced perhaps 12 seconds apart. I sat back on my heels and looked at my hand and thought about it for a moment. Then I got out my notebook and wrote, 9A floor, anomalous sub-bass vibration, regular, approximately 5 cycles, minute, origin, undetermined. Stone surface temp, 31 degrees Celsius at north quadrant, 28 degrees Celsius at south quadrant. Gradient suggests concentrated heat source to the north. Investigate 9B. I stood up, found the passage to 9B, and went through. Vault 9B was larger 40 meters by 40, and the ceiling rose to 12 meters. The limestone here was the same pale buff, but the walls were thicker, the arch haunches more pronounced, the whole structure built to carry greater load. This was not a storage vault. The proportions were wrong for storage. Someone had built this space to be a space, not to put things in, but to be inhabited. The north wall of 9B was not flat. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, because my lamp only throws so far, and the north wall was not a flat wall. It had a texture, a surface relief, complex and organic, that I could not immediately parse. I walked toward it slowly, holding my lamp out ahead of me. The texture was scale. I stopped walking. I stood very still for a long time, long enough that my lamp arm began to ache. I lowered the lamp a little. I looked at the north wall of Vault 9B. It was not a wall, or rather, it was a wall in the sense that it was load-bearing. I would later confirm this in my calculations, but it was not stone. It was a body, a colossal body, folded and compressed and settled against the vault's north end, limbs tucked, head low, filling the space from floor to 12-meter ceiling with something I had no immediate category for. Stone gray scales, each one the size of my hand, layered and overlapping, darkened at the edges where they met the stone floor in contact lines that had worn smooth over what must have been decades. 4 limbs folded against the body like a sleeping bird's wings, though these were not wings, but legs. And the actual wings, I could see the outline of them against the east wall, pressed flat. The membrane fused at points to the limestone surface, where the body's weight had held them for too long. The tail curved away to the south, looping back on itself, its tip resting against a column I had already logged as primary load-bearing piling, south quadrant, sound. The tail was resting against the column because the column was warm. The tail had been resting there, I would later calculate, for somewhere between 30 and 45 years. The face was turned slightly toward me. It was a long face, angular and ancient, the jaw massive, the brow ridges heavy with age. The eyes were closed. The nostrils were wide, and the slow rise and fall of the chest was the vibration I had felt through the floor. The breath moved in a cycle of roughly 12 seconds. The body was alive. I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down on the vault floor, cross-legged, because my knees were beginning to complain, and I looked at the creature in front of me, and I said the first thing that came to mind, which was, "Well, that explains the temperature gradient." The breathing did not change. The eyes did not open. The scaled chest rose and fell with its slow 12-second rhythm, and the sub-bass of it moved through the floor and into my sitting bones, and I sat there in the warm vault and thought about what to do. What I did not do was file a report. I want to be clear about that, and about why. I am a careful man. I record things precisely, and I report what I find. But I had been in this work long enough to know what happens when you file a report about something that nobody has a category for, in a station that is scheduled for demolition, to an authority that has not responded to a preservation note about a 600-year-old barrel arch. I knew what would happen. There would be a response team. There would be a committee. There would be a determination. And at some point, the determination would be made by people who had not sat on the floor of Vault 9B and felt the breathing through the stone and understood. In the way you understand some things only when you are in the presence of them, that the creature in front of them was old in a way that the station it was sealed inside was not old, and fragile in a way that had nothing to do with the fracture patterns of limestone. So I did not file a report. I have thought about this decision many times in the months since. I am not a man who bends rules. I have filed reports about things that cost clients money, about structural conditions that invalidated their plans, about findings that delayed projects by years. I have filed reports that made me unpopular and reports that ended contracts early. I believe in the record. I have built my professional life on the discipline of writing down what I find, accurately and completely, and letting the record do what the record does. But the record, in this case, would have gone to the Courtesan Demolition Authority, Structural Clearance Division, and would have been processed by people who had not been in this vault, and who would not, I was fairly certain, come down to be in this vault before making their determination. The determination would have been made in an office, from a report, and it would have been made quickly, because demolition authorities do not have extended timelines for anomalous findings in sub-foundation vaults of decommissioned transit hubs, and the word anomalous tends to resolve, in bureaucratic processing, toward clear and proceed, rather than investigate and preserve. I thought about the temperature gradient. I thought about the 12-second breathing cycle. I thought about the 40 years of settled stillness that had produced those contact scars on the floor, that pale, polished mark where the foreleg had rested so long the stone remembered it. I thought, I do not know how to protect something I do not yet understand, but I know how to slow a process down. So I did not file a report. I finished my notes for the day times 9B. Vault dimensionally larger than spec. Full structural assessment pending. North quadrant requires extended examination times, and I went back up the ladder, and I ate dinner, and I slept. In the morning, I went back down. I brought my full kit. I brought my thermos. Because I had been doing this for a long time and I had a methodical mind, a portable lamp with a diffuser that threw soft light rather than directed beam, because I thought that might be better. I set the diffused lamp in the center of the vault, and I began, with great care and in great silence, to do my work. The structural assessment of Vault 9B took 11 days. I measured every course of the limestone ashlar in the south, east, and west walls. I plotted the arch geometry. I calculated the load paths. I ran my crack assessment protocol on every joint I could reach, which was most of them, because the vaults in 9B were tall but not impossibly so, and I had a good ladder. The north wall, the body I measured at a distance, using sight lines and triangulation, the way you measure things you cannot put your hands on. I confirmed that the body was load-bearing. Not incidentally load-bearing, genuinely, structurally load-bearing. The mass of the body at rest, settled against the north foundation wall over 3 or 4 decades, had caused the vault's stress paths to redistribute around it. The vault was, in a real engineering sense, relying on the body's presence. Remove it, and you would need to shore the north quadrant before you could safely proceed with demolition. I wrote that up very carefully in my structural notes. Under the heading times 9B North Quadrant, anomalous load-bearing element, assessment pending. I said anomalous load-bearing element because it was accurate and because it would require someone to come down here in person to understand what it meant. And by the time someone came down here in person, I intended to have more information. On the third day, I began talking. Not to the creature directly, or rather, not addressing my remarks to it. I talked to the vault, the way I always talk when I am working alone, a running commentary on what I am finding, a conversation with the stone, and the mortar, and the geometry. This course here has settled well. 4 centuries old, and the joint is still tight. Whoever laid this knew what they were doing. The arch geometry on this end is slightly flatter than the east end, which means the original builders were compensating for something in the foundation, probably an irregularity in the bedrock. This crack here, this is old. Pre-settlement crack, formed when the vault was new and the ashlar was still finding its equilibrium. It hasn't moved in at least 2 centuries. Stable. I worked, and I talked, and the vault was warm, and the floor vibrated gently with the long, slow breathing. And I found that after the first few days, I stopped noticing the strangeness and started noticing other things. The way the warmth was distributed unevenly, slightly warmer near the folded left foreleg, slightly cooler near the tail tip. The way the scale coloration shifted toward charcoal gray at the thicker plates along the spine and lightened to something almost silver pale at the underside of the neck, where the scales were thinner and more densely packed. The way the wings, pressed flat against the east wall, had fused at 3 contact points, not painfully, or at least not recently. The tissue around each fusion point was smooth and settled, the kind of healed-over contact you see in stone when a feature has been stable long enough for the adjacent surfaces to normalize around each other. She had been here a very long time. I don't know when I started thinking of her as she. It was not a reasoned decision. It was the same kind of knowledge you gain from stone, not from measuring it, but from standing next to it long enough. On the 7th day, she opened one eye. I was on my ladder, examining the keystone of the central arch, and I not heard exactly, but felt through my feet on the ladder rungs, a change in the vibration. A slight thickening in the subbase, a shift in the rhythm. I looked down. The left eye was open. It was gold. Not the gold of metal, the gold of old amber, or of late afternoon light falling through a thick atmosphere, layered and deep. The pupil was a long horizontal ellipse, dark as basalt, and it was looking at me. I said, "Good morning." The pupil contracted slightly, then expanded. The eye did not move. The rest of the body did not move. The breathing continued at its 12-second rhythm. After a long moment, the eye closed again, slowly, like something very heavy settling, and the vault was as it had been. I went back to examining the keystone. After that, she opened the eye most mornings. Sometimes both eyes, though the right one, the eye on the side where the wing had fused to the wall, seemed to require more effort, and often stayed closed even when the left was open and tracking me. I noticed that she tracked my movement around the vault. Not dramatically, the eye did not swivel in a way that suggested agitation or alarm. It tracked the way you track something that has become familiar to you, the casual attention you pay to a person you have worked alongside for years, the peripheral awareness of someone in your space. I kept talking. I talked about the stonework, mostly, because that was what I was doing. But after a while, my commentary expanded, the way it does when you are working alone for long enough that the boundary between thinking and speaking begins to soften. I talked about the arch geometry, and I talked about my daughter's new house in the outer settlements, which she had described to me in a message as small but ours, in a way that made my chest do something complicated. I talked about my wife, sometimes. About the 41 years we had worked and argued and repaired things together. She had been a structural engineer, which is how we had met, on a remediation project in the Cordoveth outer ring. 22 years into the job and still correcting each other about load calculations. I talked about the mortar. I brought a small test batch of period-appropriate limestone mortar one morning and repointed a section of the east wall that had been bothering me, working carefully with my narrow tuck-pointing tool, and I explained each step as I did it, why the joint profile mattered, why the mortar composition mattered, why you set the mortar back slightly from the face of the stone rather than flush, because the edge of the stone is harder than the mortar, and it needs somewhere to weather to. I do not know whether any of it was meaningful to her. I do not know how much of human speech is comprehensible to a creature that has spent the better part of 4 decades breathing slowly in a sealed vault. But she kept the left eye open the whole time I worked on the east wall, and when I finished and stepped back to look at the section I had repointed, I heard, and this time it was something I could hear, not just feel through my feet a sound. Very low. A single long sustained note, so far below what the human ear is designed to appreciate, that I felt it in my sternum more than I heard it in my ear. It lasted for perhaps 8 seconds and then it stopped. I stood in the warm vault, with my tuck-pointing tool in my hand, and I said, "You're welcome." I placed my thermos against the scale at the base of her left foreleg. The joint had been bothering me for days. Not me personally, but the joint on her foreleg. The way the scale compression at the contact point showed a pattern consistent with long-term load concentration without movement, because the stone, there was warm, and I had cold coffee, and I had been doing this for weeks. Already without thinking about it, pressing my thermos against the warmest available surface when I wanted it to stay warm. She did not move. The thermos sat there. When I picked it up 40 minutes later, the coffee was hot. I wrote in my personal log that night, "She heats the vault, not incidentally deliberately. The warmth is distributed, highest concentration around the foreleg joints and the spinal plates. She is managing her own thermoregulation. She is aware of her environment." I wrote, "She has been alone down here for a very long time." I wrote, "I do not know what to do about that, except to keep coming back." The weeks accumulated. I completed the structural survey of 9B and moved into 9C, which was a smaller antechamber connected to 9B by a narrow passage that was clearly original to the vault complex. The stonework was the same pale buff limestone, the same tight jointing, but which I suspected had once been an entrance vault, a transitional space between the public levels of the station above and whatever this deepest level had originally been built to house. I thought about that often. What the station's original builders had intended. Veth Noral Station was 600 years old. The sub-foundation levels predated the freight and service levels by at least a century, which meant they had been built before the station became a transit hub, when the station was something else, an outpost, perhaps, or a way station for something other than freight. The vault's proportions were not freight architecture. They were not storage architecture. They were the proportions of a space, built to receive something large and ancient, something for which the builders had presumably had a reason. I thought about what it meant that the builders had known, and that 400 years later, the knowledge had been lost so completely that the demolition authorities pre-survey listed the vault as no active infrastructure. I kept this thought to myself. I had nobody to discuss it with except her, and I was not sure the institutional memory of the Courtesan Demolition Authority was her primary concern. On the morning of the 43rd day, I kept a precise count. From the day I had first opened the 9A access hatch, I came down the ladder and through 9A and into 9B and found both eyes open. Not the casual one-eye tracking of the past weeks. Both eyes, fully open, the amber pupils contracted to narrow ellipses in the lamplight, and the head, the enormous angular head, which I had watched for 6 weeks resting on the vault floor with the patient inertia of something that had been resting for decades, the head was lifted. Not far, perhaps 30 centimeters from the floor, but lifted, held up by the neck, it was a long neck. I had known that from my measurements, but I had not seen it extended before. The head moved slowly, tracking me as I came through the passage from 9A, and I stopped just inside the vault, and we looked at each other. I said, "Good morning." The head moved not toward me, but in a slow arc, as if she were reorienting herself to a position that she had not held in a long time. The neck moved with a deliberateness that told me the movement cost something. The joints, those long compressed joints, were not refusing her. She was not in acute distress. But the movement was measured, careful, the movement of someone who knows exactly what their range of motion is and is not exceeding it. She settled the head at a height of perhaps 40 centimeters from the floor, turned it until the left eye was facing me directly, and was still. I walked to my usual working position. I had a particular spot in the southeast quadrant of the vault where I set up my kit each morning, near the column with the unusual mortar joint I had been monitoring, and I set my kit down, and I poured coffee into the thermos lid, and I held it out in her direction. I do not know why I did that. It was not a reasoned action. It was the kind of thing you do when you have been in a place long enough that it has become familiar, and the things in it have become familiar, and you find yourself extending small courtesies that you did not decide to extend. She did not move toward the thermos lid. She did not need to. After a moment, I put it down on the floor, a meter or so in front of her lowered head, and I went back to my kit and my work. When I looked over, 20 minutes later, the thermos lid was empty. I wrote in my personal log, "She moved her head today. Both eyes open. Long dormant joints functioning. I do not know if this is new or if I have simply not been here to see it before. I think it is new. I think something is changing." In the last week of the third month, she spoke. I say spoke, but that is not quite accurate. The vault filled with sound, a complex, layered sound, low enough that I felt it in my chest and my back teeth simultaneously, with overtones that moved through the limestone and came back, changed, so that the vault itself was part of the instrument. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It was not directed at me, or not exclusively at me. It felt like something that would have traveled through bedrock. I stood very still until it finished. Then I said, "I don't understand that," but I heard it. The left eye tracked to me, held for a moment, then closed again. I wrote, "Vocalization today. Duration, 15 seconds. Low frequency, complex overtone structure. I believe it propagated through the foundation stone. I do not know what it means. I do not think it was distress. It sounded like something remembered." End quote. I added, "I should tell someone. I know I should tell someone. I will tell someone." I did not tell someone. By the fourth month, I had established a complete picture of the sub-foundation vault complex's structural condition. It was, with the exception of the anomalous load-bearing element in the 9B North Quadrant, in excellent shape. The original builders had known their stone, and 6 centuries of stable conditions had been kind to their work. I filed an interim structural report that described 9A and 9C in full, and noted that 9B required further assessment before clearance could be granted. The Demolition Authority responded 10 days later to acknowledge receipt of the report. That was the full extent of their engagement. I spent the 5th and 6th months in a work pattern that I would not have been able to explain clearly to an outside observer. I completed my structural documentation. I repointed sections of wall in 9A and 9C that needed it, not because anyone had asked me to, but because the mortar was deteriorating, and I was there, and I had the materials. I made a practice of reading my daily survey logs aloud when I was in 9B, not dramatically, not performing them, but in the same tone I used for everything else I said in that vault, matter of fact. Unhurried, the way you talk to someone who is not going anywhere, and neither are you. The vocalizations continued. Not every day, but regularly, perhaps once or twice a week, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening when I was packing up to leave. Always the same complex low frequency, always propagating through the stone. I had been writing them down since the first one. I had 23 entries. By the 7th month, I had begun to understand not the meaning of the sounds, not what they were communicating, but the rhythm of them. They came more often when I talked to her directly, which I had begun doing more frequently. They came when I repointed mortar. She seemed to find this interesting, in whatever way she found things interesting. They came when I played back recordings of my wife's voice from the clips on my personal device. because I did that sometimes in the evenings, and I had gotten into the habit of doing it in the vault rather than in my billet, for reasons I did not examine too closely. In the 8th month, she began moving the left foreleg. Not dramatically. An incremental uncurling, over days and weeks, the way ice at the edge of a melt moves. You cannot see it moving, but you can see that it has moved. The foreleg extended perhaps 30 centimeters over the course of 3 weeks, the claws massive, basalt dark, worn flat at the tips from decades of floor contact repositioning themselves. The movement revealed a section of floor that had been under the leg for a long time, paler than the surrounding stone, the contact surface smoothed to something almost polished. I measured the pale section carefully and logged it. Then I crouched down and ran my thumb across the polished stone and thought about 40 years of stillness, and I did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. The 9th and 10th months were the middle of the long stretch, the months in the middle of a long contract where the work has found its rhythm, and you are neither beginning nor ending but simply present. I was in the vault 6 days a week, 7 or 8 hours a day. I had run out of primary structural work months ago and had transitioned not by design, but by a logic that seemed obvious to me at the time into remediation and maintenance work that nobody had asked me to do and that nobody was paying me for. I repointed the 9A ceiling. The joints up there had been weeping mineral deposits for probably 50 years, and I built a scaffold and spent 3 weeks cleaning the deposits and repointing every affected joint. And I talked continuously while I did it because that is what I do. And from time to time, the low complex sound came up through the floor and I paused in my work and listened and then continued. I rebuilt the west wall of 9C, which had a section of failed ashlar the original stone had spalled badly. Probably from freeze-thaw cycling in the station's early centuries before the environmental systems were installed. And the repair was not elegant, but it was sound. I used locally sourced basalt rather than limestone because I could not match the limestone without a specialist supplier, and I noted in my log that the basalt repair was structurally adequate but aesthetically mismatched, and that if anyone cared about aesthetic matching in a sub-foundation vault scheduled for demolition, they were welcome to come down here and address it themselves. I also, and this I did not note in any formal log, began spending time simply sitting in 9B in the evenings, in the last hour before I packed up and climbed back to level 3. Not working, just sitting. I am not by nature a contemplative man. My wife was. She had a capacity for stillness that I had always admired and never fully shared. But there is something in a place that has been inhabited by deep patience for a long time that teaches you patience, the way a room that has held music teaches your ears to expect it. I sat in the warm limestone vault with the sub-bass breathing of the floor beneath me and the amber eye tracking me from across the space, and I thought about things I had not thought about in years. My wife's hands, which had been a structural engineer's hands, strong and precise, with calluses from years of field work. The way she had argued with me about load calculations on the Cordoveth remediation project 30-something years ago, in a tent on a construction platform, with rain on the membrane above us, and both of us being absolutely certain and absolutely wrong simultaneously, the way she had laughed when she found out. I thought about what it means to stay somewhere, to be present in a place consistently enough that the place begins to shape itself slightly around your presence, not physically, not necessarily, but in the way that inhabited places are different from uninhabited ones, warmer in some quality that has nothing to do with temperature. I thought about her, about 40 years of this vault, sealed in, growing until the exits were no longer exits, the station above her slowly changing and slowly emptying and then going silent. About what you keep hold of in that kind of stillness. About what you let go. I thought, I do not know anything about her history. I do not know her name or her lineage or what she was doing when the vault was sealed. I do not know if the sealing was intended or accidental, if she chose this or if it was chosen for her. I have 14 months of observations and 27 vocalization entries, and the fact that she heats the vault, and she says my name, and she tracked my thermos with what I have decided was recognition. I thought. That is enough to keep coming back on. That has always been enough. I calculated in the 11th month that I had approximately 90 days of contract remaining. I had not, in 14 months, resolved the question of what to do about her. I had, in 14 months, resolved the question of what to do every day. Every day I went down the ladder and through 9A and into 9B, and I set up my kit and I poured my coffee and I worked and I talked. I had gotten into the habit of describing the day's weather, or rather the freight lane conditions visible from my level 3 window, since there was no weather inside a decommissioned station. But I told her about the transit traffic patterns, about the tankers I could see making the courtesan approach, about the unusual double column formation. I had seen a Soral Keth survey flight use when making an orbital insertion 2 months ago, because I had been interested in it, and it had given me something to describe. I did not know what she made of any of it. I did not know how much of the human language she had absorbed over the 14 months I had been talking to her. I suspected more than I could verify. The tracking of her eyes had become more responsive over the months when I mentioned something that interested her. The pupils shifted, the head tilted fractionally. She tracked my kit when I unpacked it in the morning. She tracked the thermos with what I had decided was recognition, which is perhaps projection on my part, but I do not think so. In the 11th month, 3 weeks into it, she said my name. I was at the east wall, examining a section of the old contact scar, where the wing membrane had fused. I had been measuring it every week for months, tracking whether any change was occurring, and I heard the low vocalization begin, the familiar chest resonance of it, and I was about to go back to my measurement when the sound changed. In the middle of the complex overtone structure, there was something different, a shape, a pattern that was not the usual pattern. It took me a moment. Then I realized I was hearing not in the sense of individual phonemes, but in the sense of a signature, a recognizable configuration of frequencies that my brain was mapping to a known pattern, my name. Not the way a human says a name, the way a foundation says it. Through stone, through the soles of my feet, up through my spine. Neven. I held very still. The sound continued for another 10 seconds, and then stopped. I turned around. Both eyes were open. The head was up, fully up, as high as the neck would allow without straining, the jawline level with the top of my ladder. The amber eyes were fixed on me with an attention that was different from any attention she had shown me before. Not the tracking, not the habitual awareness. Something directed, something intentional. I said, in a voice that was steadier than I expected, "That's my name." A sound came back. Shorter, the same shaped overtone. I said, "Yes, I'm Neven." She lowered her head a little, not all the way to the floor. To a middle position? A position she had developed over the past 4 months, the compromise position where the neck was neither fully at rest nor straining, and from which she could hold the eye contact for extended periods. She held it now. I said, "I've been talking to you for about a year, and you've never done that before. I wasn't sure you knew what I was saying." The left foreleg moved, a slow uncurling, further than it had gone before the full extension of it, all the way out. The great clawed foot settling on the floor 3 meters further from the body than it had been when I arrived 14 months ago. The motion was deliberate and unhurried. I said, "That looks good. Does it hurt?" The eye held mine. I said, "Probably a stupid question. I'm sorry." I went back to my measurement. I wrote it down. My hand was shaking slightly, which I noted clinically and attributed to low blood sugar because I had not eaten breakfast. 3 days later, the station began vibrating. Not the sub-bass of her breathing, something different, external. A harmonic input coming from above, from the station's upper levels, reverberating down through the basalt columns of level 8 and into the limestone of 9A and 9B. I was in 9B when I felt it, and I stopped what I was doing and put my palm on the floor. Not seismic. The pattern was wrong for seismic. It was organized, layered, complex. I looked up at her. Both eyes were open, and she was fully alert. Not the alert of distress, but the alert of recognition. The head was up, The neck was extended. From her chest came a sound I had not heard before. A long, rising tone, higher than her usual sub-bass. Something that passed through audible range as a brief rumble before climbing back out of it. The sound moved through the floor, through the walls, through the limestone and the basalt above it, upward. I said, "You know what that is." The left foreleg extended further. The right foreleg, the one on the fused wing side, which had barely moved in 14 months, shifted. A single, slow repositioning, the first I had seen. I sat down on the vault floor. The harmonic from above continued, and her answering sound continued. And for perhaps 20 minutes, the sub-foundation vault of Veth Noral Station was filled with a conversation I could feel in my bones, but could not parse. And I sat in the warm stone and listened to it and let it run through me. Then it stopped. The silence was different from the usual silence, not empty anticipatory. I heard them on the level 8 ladder before I heard them in 9A. Footsteps, or what I took for footsteps, though the gait was wrong for human feet, longer and heavier, the contact pattern of something that walked on 4 limbs rather than 2. Then in 9A, moving through it, and then the passage from 9A into 9B, and I stood up and faced the passage. There were 4 of them. The first through the passage was the largest I could have imagined, and still not imagined correctly. Pale copper, the color of old pipework, with scales that caught my diffused lamplight and held it, scattered it into warm fragments. The head was long and the neck was long and the body was, I stepped back involuntarily, not from fear exactly, but from the simple physical logic of an object too large for the available category. The vault, which had seemed adequately large to me for 14 months, was suddenly smaller. Behind the first came 3 others, a rust-red adult, smaller, who moved with a deliberateness that suggested some kind of assessment function. A deep gray, who entered and immediately located her on the north wall and held position, looking at her with an intensity that was entirely unlike my own. And a fourth, pale as winter light, very old, who came in last and placed itself in the southeast quadrant, my working quadrant, with the specific care of something that understands load paths and is choosing its position accordingly. None of them attended to me immediately. Their attention was on the north wall, on her. And then, she was different from how I had ever seen her. The head was fully elevated, the neck at its maximum extension, both eyes open and fully dilated, and she was making sounds I had not heard before, not the deep sub-bass vibration of her breathing, not the complex low vocalization she used when she spoke to me, but something that rang. Overtones in ranges I could actually hear, rising and falling, a response to the harmonic inputs the 4 newcomers were producing, a conversation that was carrying at speeds and in dimensions that my instruments would never adequately capture. I stood in the southeast quadrant, next to the pale ancient who had chosen my corner, and I did not move. The pale ancient looked at me. I do not know how to describe the quality of that look. It was not hostile. It was not the casual tracking I had grown accustomed to in 9B. It was the look of an assessment, not the kind my structural reports make, not a measurement of cracks and load paths, but the kind of assessment you make when you are trying to understand how something came to be in a condition that surprises you. I said, "I'm the restoration surveyor. I was hired to assess the sub-foundation levels before demolition." The ancient looked at me for another long moment. Then it looked at the north wall, at her, and back at me. I said, "I found her on the 43rd day. I didn't file a report." A sound came from the ancient, not directed at me, but at the room. The copper pale one responded without looking away from the north wall. A brief exchange, low and layered. Then the copper pale one turned her head. I will say her because the quality of the attention she brought to the room was the same quality I had spent 14 months learning to recognize, and looked at me for the first time. The look lasted a long time. I did not look away, not because I was trying to be impressive, but because I was too tired for performed composure and too old for it, and the amber eyes on the north wall had trained me out of the habit. The copper pale one spoke. The sound moved through the vault and through the floor and through my chest, and it resolved, as her speaking always resolved for me, not as individual words, but as a shape, a configuration of meaning that my brain assembled from the available information. I understood. How long? I said, 14 months, approximately, 342 days. The copper pale one looked at the north wall again. A long exchange between them. I could feel it in the floor, the back and forth of it, the old slow rhythms of hers and the newer, stronger rhythms of the copper pale one, meshing and responding. Then her sound came to me, the shaped sound, the familiar configuration. Neven. I said, yes. Another sound, shaped differently. A new configuration, one I had not heard before, but it resolved, as they always resolved. Not as a word exactly, but as an understanding. The way you understand something that is told to you in a language you do not speak, but in a room where all the other available information makes the meaning clear. What I understood was the one who kept the foundation company while it remembered how to breathe. I stood in the southeast quadrant of Vault 9B, in the warm limestone buffered air, with the sub-bass of her breathing moving through the floor, and the lamp throwing its diffuse light across 40 years of settled stillness, and I looked at the copper pale one who was looking at me, and I said, "Is that a name?" The copper pale one produced a sound. The ancient in my corner produced a sound. The rust red, without looking away from the north wall, produced a sound. Her sound came last, and it was the longest, and it moved through me the way her sounds had always moved through me, through the stone, through the soles of my feet, through my spine, into my chest. I said, "I'll take that as yes." The copper pale one turned fully to face me then, and lowered her head not to the floor, not in the way an exhausted thing lowers its head, but in the way that something honors another thing. Deliberately, held, with the full awareness of what the gesture means. I did not know what to do with that. I had spent 40 years reading the structural intentions of buildings. I had no equivalent reference for this. I said, "She's load-bearing. I noted it in my survey. The vault has redistributed its stress paths around her. If you move her, you'll need to shore the north quadrant before the demolition can proceed." I paused. "I'd recommend not demolishing it." The copper pale one was still looking at me. I had the impression she had understood approximately none of that and all of it simultaneously. I said, "She's been here a long time. I thought someone should know." The rust-red one spoke then to the copper pale one, not to me, and there was a long exchange in which the pale ancient in my corner participated, and from the north wall her sound came and went. And I stood in the warm vault and waited, because I had been in places that were having conversations without me for my entire working life, and I know how to wait. After a time, the copper pale one looked at me again. What came was not a sound, or it was a sound, but it was also something else, a pressure in the air of the vault, a change in the way the warmth was distributed. A quality that I recognized from 14 months of daily presence as attention, the specific form of attention that means, "I see you clearly." I looked back at her steadily. I had spent 14 months in the presence of amber eyes that tracked me without judgment, and I had lost whatever impulse I might once have had toward performed composure. I was an old man with sore knees and a tuck-pointing tool in my kit, and a personal log with 342 entries, and I was being looked at by something that had come across whatever distance she had come across to find the creature on the north wall, and neither of those facts seemed to require me to be anything other than what I was. She looked at me for a long time. Then she made a sound, not the complex harmonic exchange she had been conducting with the north wall, and not the assessment-directed sounds she had been producing with the others. Something shorter. Something shaped like a question. The ancient in my corner responded briefly, in that same low-frequency language, and then looked at me. And I had the distinct impression I was being discussed in terms I would not fully understand, but which were not, on the whole, unfavorable. The rust red turned from the north wall and added something, and there was a brief exchange between the three of them, the copper pale, the ancient, The rust red, while the gray held its position at the north wall, attending to her with a steadiness that suggested to me some kind of medical or assessor function. I watched the gray work because it was working. I was certain of that, producing low sustained tones in direct contact with the north wall's stonework at regular intervals, listening for what came back, and I thought about resonance testing, about the way you tap a column and listen for the hollow note that tells you the interior is failing. I said, to no one in particular. She's been vocalizing consistently for about 8 months. The frequency structure is complex. I've logged 27 entries. The pattern has changed over time. More overtones in the upper range in recent months. The rust red looked at me. I said, I don't know if that's useful information. I'm a stonecutter, not a whatever the relevant specialty would be. I just wrote down what I observed. The ancient in my corner made a sound that I could not parse, but that felt, by some quality I could not have quantified, like the sound of someone reconsidering an assumption. The copper pale one looked at me again. What I understood was, I see you clearly. I said, I know. Then I went to my kit in the southeast quadrant, and I began packing up. Not because I was done, I had 2 hours left in my workday, but because I thought the vault needed the space, and because I had completed, in some sense I did not entirely understand, the work I had come to do. The structural documentation was finished. The remediation was done. Whatever else had happened in this vault over the past 342 days was not in any survey template I had ever been given, but it was finished too, in the way that things finish when something arrives to continue them. I packed my tuck-pointing tools. I packed my mortar box. I packed my notebook with its 342 days of surveys and structural logs, and the 27 entries for low-frequency vocalizations, and the single entry that read, in full. She said my name. 11th month, day 3. Both eyes open. Left foreleg extended. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about any of this. I am going to keep coming back. I latched my kit. I picked up my thermos. I went to the north wall tour. To the great stone gray ancient, whose left foreleg was extended, and whose both eyes were open, and whose breathing moved through the limestone of the vault at 12-second intervals. And I put my hand on the scale at the base of the foreleg joint, the scale I had been monitoring for 6 weeks, the one whose contact with the floor had left the small, pale, polished mark that I had measured and not known what to say about. The scale was warm. It had always been warm. I said, I'm going upstairs to update my survey log. I'm going to mark the north quadrant load-bearing element as confirmed permanent infrastructure. That should complicate the demolition clearance for a few years. I took my hand off the scale. I said, Keth Neven. I'll have to look up what that means properly, but I think I understand it well enough. I picked up my kit and my thermos, and I walked through the passage into 9A and up the vertical shaft and through the level 8 maintenance corridor and up the access ladder and into the light. In my site billet on level 3, I opened my survey log template. I found the entry for Subfoundation Level 9, Vault 9B. Under Structural Status, I deleted Times Assessment Pending Times, and I typed, in the careful phrasing that demolition authorities spend months untangling, Load-bearing element confirmed North Quadrant structural dependency verified. Element cannot be removed without full North Quadrant remediation. Estimated remediation scope requires specialist assessment and extended engineering review. Demolition clearance, not recommended pending full investigation. I saved the file. I looked out the window at the Courtesan freight lanes. A tanker was making the approach in the familiar double-column formation. I watched it for a while. The formation was precise and unhurried, the way things move when they know where they are going and are not in a hurry about it. I poured what was left in my thermos into the lid and drank it. It was still warm. I wrote one more entry in my personal log, not the structural log, the personal one, the one that nobody would read. It said, 343 days, 14 months. I talked to the Foundation every day, and I did not know I was being listened to, and it turns out that was sufficient. It turns out that was exactly sufficient. I put the log away. I looked out the window. The formation was gone now, folded into the courtesan approach corridor, somewhere out of sight and moving somewhere with purpose. And the freight lanes were, as they always were, steady, unhurried, full of things I did not know the names of yet, going somewhere I had not been. I picked up my thermos and went to make coffee. Tomorrow morning I would go back down.